And there we go, we are recording. Firstly, I'm just going to hand over to our panelist Pere to do a karakia to open this meeting up for us.
Kia ora, ngā mihi ni. Ko te mea tuatahi me mihi atu kia koutou e hui hui mai nei. Ko te mea tuarua e mihi ana ki ngā kaiwhakahaere o tēnei hui tino whakahirahira. Tuarua he karakia. Ua heke hukarewa awanui arangi awanui a nuku ngā wai e rua o te wairua mana wai o te puia taharangi ki ngā awa awa ki ngā manga ki ngā puna kia rere tonu i te mania ki te tā poko poko ātawhaki te tapu te ora no reira ti he wa Māori tai ao. Kia ora tātou. Ni, back over to you. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. So, as I said, welcome. This event is part of Organics Week. My name is Neva Flynn. I'm the program director at Greenpeace Aotearoa, and very interested in this kaupapa tonight. I've been working on getting a global agriculture campaign with Greenpeace off the ground that's focusing on the intersections between agriculture and climate change. So really excited for the conversation tonight and the speakers that we have. It's a pretty quick conversation. We've only got an hour, so we'll try and keep things moving, but we know that there's a lot more to dig into here, and there's a bigger conversation. So we'll be looking at where the interest is lying and think about where we might want to have the next conversation as part of this chat between the panelists. So tonight we're going to be talking about the connections between the climate crisis, the dairy industry, land use, and food sovereignty. And as you all know, our planet is at an incredibly crucial time in how our society addresses not just the climate crisis, but also this food crisis and the intersections between them. We're working on this campaign globally, but in Aotearoa, we see that agriculture is the single biggest climate polluter here, and Fonterra is the biggest single company who's part of this problem. So we really see it as this massive way for New Zealand to make a real change in how we contribute to the climate fight in the global sphere as well as here at home. And obviously the links to biodiversity and biodiversity loss and water pollution, there's so many links to this work. So how we work towards a just climate future is so tied to how we make decisions around land use, food, and the economy. So our speakers are going to talk to us all a bit more about that. Unfortunately, Dr. Mike Joy has had to pull out this evening, but we will still have a great, rich conversation, and you'll get to hear a little bit more from each one of our speakers, which is a happy upside to this whole thing. So to briefly introduce you to our speakers, we have Pere Huriwai-Seger, who thank you, Pere, for doing this karakia for us right at the beginning. Who is an activist, a husband, and a world champion extreme unicyclist. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm hoping to hear more on whether that is. You can maybe upvote that as a question that we find out through the chat. Pere co-runs the decolonial justice project Aotearoa Liberation League and co-produced the award-winning documentary Milked. So absolute pleasure to have you with us tonight, Pere. Great to have you here. We've also got Shane Ward, who's an agroecologist, a regenerative land use advisor and designer, a communicator, and the founder of Action Ecology. Shane brings an international perspective, scientific rigor, and pragmatic approach to connecting people with the right knowledge, drawn from both innovative and on-the-ground practices and the latest research. So very excited to have you with us as well, Shane. Give everyone a little wave. And of course, we have Christine Rose, who is the climate campaigner at Greenpeace Aotearoa. And Christine grew up on a dairy pig and sheep farms in the Waikato. She has degrees in philosophy and politics and spent 15 years as a local and regional councillor for rural Rodney district, northwest of Auckland. She's worked for a range of NGOs, including World Animal Protection, and she's now here with us at Greenpeace in the same building, in fact. So we are going to start this chat. I can see you all starting to use the chat function. Great to see you. I've got you from the UK. Amazing. Great to see you all coming in. So to kick off, we're going to give each speaker 5 minutes to talk about their perspective on the connections between climate, agriculture, land use, food sovereignty, and how it relates to your work. So huge topic and open to how you want to tackle that. And we'll ask questions as we go. So feel free to start using that chat function and the Q&A function, people, and I'll keep an eye on that. And Christine Rose, I will hand to you first.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for the introduction, Neve, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's a big subject, and I'm going to talk about the role of dairy and methane and why we call this our methane moment, and the opportunity that methane moment provides for us to change our land use system so that they work with instead of against nature. As many of us know, dairy's shaped Aotearoa since colonisation was the farm of the empire, and that led to land appropriation, the clearance of forests, the draining of swamps, and the transformation of this land, its waters and its people. And since then, there's been a lot of power in the agricultural sector, and in particular, that's grown since big dairy expansion, especially between 1990 and 2019. In that time, we saw the doubling of the national dairy herd, and in some places, that was even more so. So Canterbury went up 10 times in the number of dairy cows, and Southland went up 16 times in that 30-year period. And the amount of synthetic nitrogen fertiliser to support that dairy herd increased around 700%. So it's massive. And came with that were subsidised irrigation schemes that sucked rivers and aquifers dry. As the apex polluter in New Zealand and as the apex producer of dairy products, Fonterra is New Zealand's biggest company. It's the 6th largest dairy producer in the world. 95% of New Zealand's dairy products are exported. And all of that has seen a reduction in biodiversity, a rise in greenhouse gas emissions, our rivers and lakes polluted, so that now only 2% of them are in a healthy state, and our drinking water has been contaminated. As was alluded to by Neve, the New Zealand emissions profile is now around 50% from agriculture, and almost a quarter of that is from dairy cows, and it's not the cow's fault. They're victims in the system too. Fonterra is the country's worst climate polluter, causing almost double the emissions of the next polluter in the list, and that's Z Energy. Big dairy and Fonterra's greenhouse gas emissions are particularly bad because of the amount of superheating, methane and nitrous oxide, and they are climate superheaters. And we call them superheaters because over a 20-year period, methane heats up the globe 84 times more than the same amount of carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide is almost 300 times more powerful than CO2. And because of the global warming potential of methane in particular, it's a methane emergency. But that also means that reducing those superheating methane emissions from the agriculture sector is especially important, and it's something that can and must be done. And so it's also a methane moment. Addressing methane emissions means that we can give ourselves a greater chance of staying below the 1.5 degrees warming that was agreed to under the Paris Accord. So by reducing emissions from methane emissions in particular from dairy, we can give ourselves enough time to decarbonise society and lower CO2 emissions. So we can have some quick wins on methane by addressing dairy emissions in particular. And that really gives us a chance and may well determine whether global warming can be kept below that 1.5 degree, sort of lifeline. So for regional Māori communities and for small island states like our Pacific neighbours, that target's absolutely critical. It can make the difference between survival or destruction. Those communities in particular are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and they're actually leading the charge to build more resilient, climate just futures, calling for countries like New Zealand to do their fair share of the mahi, and we're not doing our fair share yet. We're a small country, but we have some of the highest emissions per capita in the OECD. The impacts of climate change are already tragically evident. We've seen cyclones, storms, and in my own community, we've had houses down the hillside and volunteer firefighters dead. But that's not exceptional. We're seeing it across the country and across the world. And Vanuatu, for example, is still reeling from 2 devastating cyclones that came in quick succession. The government has a really important role as a regulator of big dairy. They can ensure that the right policies are put in place to de-intensify the dairy herd and end the inputs that, like synthetic nitrogen fertiliser and palm kernel expiller, that we put onto the land and feed our cows to increase production at any cost, and the cost is great. The government has the power to support, implement and enforce solutions that will make rivers swimmable again, that will make drinking water safe to drink from the tap, and that will protect our climate and biodiversity for generations to come. The time is now. It's election year. It needs to be a climate election, and we need your help to do that. So thanks for being here again, and thanks for this important kōrero. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Christine. Thank you. And thanks for starting to touch on the kind of what we need regulators and the government to do, and how I think that starts to touch on how people might be involved in this. So we might head back that direction in a little while. Thanks so much. Pere, over to you. Same question. How does this all link up for you and your work?
Kia ora tātou, he mihi anō kia koutou katoa, and thank you, Christine. That was a riveting speech. I feel a bit more invigorated about this kōrero. I was reflecting on dairy and kind of, you know, how far I've come in terms of my journey with dairy and where we're at now, and it can be very overwhelming. And so it's times like now that I'm reminded of how important our hobbies are and other things that we love to keep ourselves going. For me, yes, world champion unicyclist. It's one of my hobbies that, yeah, it keeps me going, and it's something that we as activists we need to remind ourselves of, because this journey that we're on, especially for activists, we're too reactive, I find, and that's something that I've criticized myself on in recent times, is how reactive I've been in terms of the way that I've been choosing to respond to the dairy industry. And yeah, it's a constant struggle for me. I'm constantly thinking that I'm needing to take things back a little bit more and view things from a more foundational level. In my activism, that means addressing the root cause, the root issue of the dairy industry. And for me, that's colonization. For me, it's colonial land theft and this extractive model of capitalism that's, yeah, it's bad for all of us, not just Māori. And so I feel recently with the dairy industry, we've gotten a little bit lost simply talking about emissions. And I'm finding the need again and again to kind of remind ourselves to be patient, remind ourselves to not be so reactive. And yes, of course, the climate emergency, it's right here, right now, affecting many of us. However, you know, we used to talk about our waterways. Fresh water used to be a climate issue. It helped Labour get into power. But in the recent cycles of our government, what has the call been replaced with in terms of fresh water? Well, it's been 3 waters. And as our freshwater ecologist Mike Joy reminds us of constantly, 3 waters is missing the source water, the 4th water. But anyway, so now we're talking about emissions, and of course I support focusing on methane. It gives us a great chance to, you know, in that short term, to really drastically reduce our emissions so that we can focus on CO2. But for me, it's when we narrow our view that we weaken ourselves. I want to see us bring back in our kōrero about the importance of our fresh water. I want us to talk not just about colonization and how colonization has led to these farms being established, unchallenged, untaxed. I want to see us talking about the dairy industry's impact in our healthcare system, in our education system. We need to be using all of these different facets to create a more comprehensive response to the dairy industry. But yeah, I mean, I'm really preaching to the choir here. I know that, and I'm echoing a lot of what Christine has said. The connections are everywhere. And for me, that was highlighted in our film, Milked, just how the dairy industry is overflowing absolutely everywhere. We can talk about it from all sorts of angles. But one that I have been focusing on myself is this aspect of racism. When it came to 3 waters, when it's come to groundswell, constantly this anti-Māori sentiment has been present in those spaces, and it's always used as a political football. You always see National New Zealand First ACT Party using Te Ao Māori as a political football, and it's the same when it comes to co-governance, 3 waters with groundswell. it needs to be addressed. It can't be swept under the carpet, this issue of racism. We have the ACT Party, David Seymour, wanting to have a referendum on the interpretation of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And, you know, denialism around Te Tiriti o Waitangi and animal agriculture goes back a long way. How entrenched animal agriculture is with colonization and now today's primary industries, you know, they're connected to the hip, and it's been that way since the dawn of New Zealand. For example, you know, we have the Treaty of Waitangi Act, which was brought in 1975. Later on, an amendment was added because of a dairy farmer. His name's Alan Titford, and he used a lot of anti-Māori rhetoric and racism. The guy even burnt down his own house, his own farmhouse, and he blamed it on local Māori. And this was to build anti-Māori sentiment. And because of this anti-Māori sentiment and pressure from farmers, an amendment was added to the Treaty of Waitangi Act that essentially protected private land ownership. It prevented the tribunal from being able to recommend to the Crown to buy back stolen land for a treaty settlement. And so the reason why now a lot of our stolen Māori land is so attached at the hip, you know, unable to pull it apart, is because of the work of dairy farmers. It's because of animal agriculture that Treaty of Waitangi today is quite constricted. And so as we move forward into this election year, I just remind people that these mechanisms of colonization and these tools of colonialism, they are still very present. They're in our political discourse. They're still being used as a political football. And if we sweep it under the rug, it's going to continue to trip us up endlessly. As long as race relations in Aotearoa and Māori sovereignty is not recognized, and we are not all collectively moving towards constitutional reform to recognize the sovereignty of tangata whenua, then this is a problem that I find is going to continually trip us up. And the division, the racial division in Aotearoa, it's hard to measure where it's going. You know, is it just that the racists are loud because they're dying out, or are they picking up steam? It's hard to gauge. So I just encourage everyone, karawhiua, be brave, learn about Te Ao Māori. There are some beautiful aspects of Te Ao Māori in terms of how we can protect our environment, and things that we can learn from Te Ao Māori in terms of environmental stewardship. But that also, this issue of racism is ever present, and that we can't turn a blind eye to it. But yeah, that's pretty much my kōrero. I wanted to give a slight a heads up. We have an event coming up on the 13th of May. There's the National Dairy Industry Awards, and myself and a coalition of us, we're going to protest the National Dairy Awards. So if you want to learn more about that, you can go onto our Instagram or our Facebook, search up Aotearoa Liberation League. We'd love to collaborate with you and to raise our voice louder so that we can say that there's nothing to celebrate in terms of big dairy. Kia ora. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you for that. Yeah, really good to have a little bit more of an in-depth look at the links between colonization, big dairy, racism. I think that's definitely a place for us to talk quite a lot more about as we go through, and the links are so, you know, broad ranging and go so far back in this country. And so I think that's part of where the cultural hegemony comes from for the dairy industry that can do no wrong in this country. So really great to hear a bit more about that. And I think we'll probably have some questions around milk as well in a little bit. Shane, same question. How do you see all of these intersecting issues playing out in your work?
I mean, kia ora everyone. It's a big topic. I mean, you know, there's so many things here and they're all connected, you know. But look, you know, the truth is we've all got a lot we have to do. You know, we've got to avoid catastrophic climate breakdown. We've got to stop biodiversity loss. We've got to restore and protect our waters. We've got to design and implement a permanent agriculture that works with natural systems. We need to build a more resilient and equitable food system, and we need to try and bring everyone with us as we do it. And that's not a small task, you know, but it's at the same time, it's also not optional. The simple fact is that we cannot have a permanent society without a permanent agriculture. So, you know, I'm not putting aside the climate thing, but it's worth remembering that even if we weren't trying to tackle that as well and solve this massive problem, we would still have to be solving that, because at the moment, our entire food system, you know, globally and agriculture globally, for the most part, is extractive. It is destructive. So we still need to solve that problem. It's not a nice to have. It's not an add-on. It's not a little extra thing. It's seriously fundamental to us as a civilization. And what do we do about that? What's our response going to be? So in my work as an agroecologist, as a regenerative land use designer and advisor, etc., you know, at Action Ecology, what I do is I work with people to help try and design alternatives. You know, how answer the question: how can we work with the land? How can we understand it better? How can we design and manage systems that operate along ecological principles and produce food, fibre and fuel in a way that, you know, hopefully supports and restores biodiversity, looks after our water, etc. So, you know, these big questions are right at the heart of what I do. And I loved both what Christine and Pere were saying, and there was, you know, something that Pere was saying that really sort of struck a chord with me. You know, and I agree that we can't be reactive. We can't separate, you know, the historical paradigm, the story, the narrative of where we've come from and what brought us to this point in time now, and the thought processes, and recognise the shadow that they cast on how we do things today. And I think that, you know, the dairy industry in particular, you know, we're talking about tonight, but we also see it around the world. You know, the constant theme of extractive land use. You know, we subsume everything to the pursuit of profit. And, you know, if we want to change this, and of course, you know, we can discuss, we could spend hours discussing this in lots of different aspects, but, you know, broadly speaking, if we want to change this, we need to make different, better choices. You know, we need to be the opposite of reactive, you know, and for me, part of that is being creative. It's the creative impulse, and design is a key part of that. So I love working with people to, you know, help them find alternate ways of doing that, because we can, you know, it's important to understand that we have the status quo, the what there is now, and then also the what could be. And that's the one that's a bit more mysterious for most people. And that is, I think, where I often offer a lot of value and help people understand what could be. What could their land look like? How could their land use be in 50 years' time? How can we think beyond the box of just industrial monocultures and think about integrated systems that, you know, hopefully provide a multitude of different outputs that only have a light footprint on the landscape and have a real sense of place, and hopefully connect people, and, you know, are still profitable, and they're, you know, valuable enterprises, and they can support rural communities and stronger, more local, resilient food systems, you know, all of this sort of stuff. But often, you know, we still have to start day one with the land, and where are we in the world, and how does it work, and what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about. And again, without getting into too much of the detail, I just think that when we're talking about all these things, it's always important to remember that we need to be mindful about how we discuss stuff and solutions of how we might address some of these problems, and not, you know, lose sight of the fact that this is very nuanced. There's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of factors where it really depends, you know, on place, and it must, you know, context is king. And in a way, you know, just like when you are farming a landscape, the more simplified you make it, the discussion, the poorer the outcome will be. You know, it is naturally complex, and we have to embrace that rather than pretend that it's not, just to make it convenient, because that is in fact where the problems start to arise. You know, so yes, alongside, you know, climate breakdown, we've got, you know, soil loss, which is a massive problem, you know, biodiversity loss, all of these things. And I think that we always got to remember that, you know, that farmers, the people who are the land, hopefully the stewards of the land, and they are the stewards of the land, but hopefully will become, you know, better and more engaged stewards of the land over time. They're a key part of the solution. We can't do it without them, you know. So in all of this, you know, we've got a huge problem. There's absolutely no arguing with that. We do need to be looking at, you know, how can we be disincentivizing or banning, you know, damaging practices, you know, where, you know, the role of regulation and all that sort of stuff. It's all necessary. In addition to that, we also need to be looking at how can we incentivize the better practice, great practice. How can we be getting out of the way of people actively helping and supporting those that are regenerating their landscapes, that care deeply about where they are and the health of their landscape, and that really want to be doing that. And we're not quite there yet. There's a lot of obstacles to people. Everyone that I know, the best farmers that I know, every single one of them has been doing great work despite the current situation and paradigm, not because of it. They're not incentivized to do it. They do it because they care, and they do a good job of it. But that is one of the key challenges, I think. And there's a lot more that we can get into. But I guess one of the key things I just want to sort of zoom back out again and say that the only food system, the only agriculture, the only land use pattern that is viable long term is one that can exist within ecological limits. Our economy can only exist within ecological limits, and if we don't get that right, then the whole thing is going to fall down anyway. So we really need to sort of remember that, I think.
Kia ora, Shane, thanks. And I think it's really interesting how you talk about working within ecological limits, because I think for a lot of people who are coming to the agriculture issue from a climate perspective, it's quite a shift to think about the fact that agriculture is not like the fossil fuel industry. It has a lot of the same destructive powers and a lot of the same kind of industry power, but we still need to keep agriculture going in the long term. And so thinking about how it looks differently as opposed to just not existing is really important. So I really think that's a important conversation for us to be having.
Can I just add one more quick last bit to that? Sorry, because you just reminded me of something I really wanted to say, which is that, obviously we need to move away from this simplistic industrial monoculture system. But what we have is a food system which is dictated by an economic system, which is forced onto an ecological system, right? And the ecological system operates on completely different principles to the other two. And that's fundamentally the issue we have. Like that's why it's so bad, why we have the problem. And I'm happy to get into that more later, but I just wanted to sort of make that point.
Yeah, thank you. That's very true. All of these systems of different kinds of oppressions all on top of each other. Okay, so we have a few questions in the chat. I'm just going to encourage panelists that if you see questions that you can give a nice simple answer to, please jump into the Q&A section and feel free to engage there. We have a couple of different questions around how people engage with the issue. So there's a question around student strikes. There was a question for Pere around how local communities get this message across, and someone else, I might read this last question out and use this as the question to ask you all. But considering the fierce pushback we see whenever attempts are made to regulate our farming sector, such as live animal export and intensive winter grazing, it's difficult to feel like we can make a tangible difference when it comes to big dairy, our largest earning export. Calls for change are often framed as merely ideological. I'd love to hear thoughts from the panelists on how our movement can cut through this difficult political environment to achieve policy change, particularly in an election year. And the first question was directed specifically at you, Pere, so we might start with you on that around how do you think, what can people do? How do we get cut through on this issue?
It's difficult, right? I mean, so my mahi, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention it before, but with Aotearoa Liberation League, one of the things we do is we create short 1-minute videos. And the idea is to just make information more accessible. We deliver facts in a condensed way. It seems to be working for people. In terms of how do you get cut through, we have to talk about issues that people want to know about. You have to make it relatable. You have to talk about what works for them. We have to meet people where they're at. Different strokes for different folks, come at it from all angles kind of thing. But we have to talk about what people want to talk about and provide solutions. If we're just talking about how big the problem is and how hard it is and how difficult and how we're all doomed, I don't find that really connects with people. You have to be providing some solutions as well. But yeah, that's kind of it for me. I mean, moving forward in an election year, how do we get more people on this side from this block to vote with us in terms of environmental reform, animal welfare regulations? For me, we need to talk about inequality. We need to talk about racism. We need to talk about institutional problems that affect our people and push them away from engagement. You know, we have so many people who are struggling with the cost of living, struggling with inequality because we don't have a fair tax system in Aotearoa. And so, you know, there are these foundational issues that I kind of come back to. You know, how do our people have time to rally and campaign when they have the cost of living to worry about? You know, so for me, it comes back to being just a general issue around inequality and poverty. That's how we get, like, for animal rights, for example. I'm an animal rights activist, but continually I'm finding that this is the hardest kōrero to have with people. It depends where they are, different strokes for different folks, always. But for me, animal rights and animal liberation is something that is going to come along with the liberation of our whenua, the liberation of our people, the cleaning of our waterways. These are things that we can aim for that resonates with people, and things like animal rights can be brought along with it. But yeah, different strokes for different folks. It's a very hard kōrero to give people, that's for sure, but that's all I've got for this one. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you. And I think you're right. It's about keeping these issues pushing forward together. That's a really interesting point. Christine, I'm going to ask you the same question, and then I'm going to move us to talk a little bit more about regenerative and organic farming, and we'll start with Shane. So Christine, how do you think we can make the change? And right now, how do people get involved and shape election?
Thanks. Well, there are lots of entry points, and because big dairy is having impacts on so many different areas. So as Pere said, you know, for some it might be animal rights, for some it might be water quality, drinking water, climate. And for many of us, it's all of those things. And so it's really important that we do use our power, our voices, and our bodies. And so as we know, it's election year. So at the moment, there's not much difference between National and Labor in terms of where they sit on agriculture and big dairy in particular. And we need to call that out. But then also, as the movement grows, you know, because we do wax and wane as our energy levels and our trust in the system changes. And, you know, it's pretty hard to have trust in the system, so we need to change the system. And as the movement does continue to grow again, you know, we will look to make and promote opportunities to speak truth to power. And so the National Dairy Awards event that Pere mentioned, coming up on the 13th of May, we'd love to see you there if you're in Tamaki Makaurau. The climate strikes that are coming up that have been mentioned in the chat, that's really important to show forth. The stuff that Jen's doing in Otago with students, meeting politicians, but also moving beyond that and taking action within our own communities. You know, no action is too small or too grand because we're in the fight of our lives. So, yeah, look out for opportunities, both in the large scale and in growing our own veggies, you know, because action is fertile. And I think that's a nice segue to Shane.
Okay, Shane, so I'm going to, thanks, Christina, that's awesome. I'm going to move us, a very good segue. I'm going to try and summarize a few questions. So we have, like, where is sustainability in this agriculture conversation that we're having? How much do farmers kind of understand about permaculture or regenerative farming? And there's another question that's here around how can Greenpeace or I guess change-making organizations support that transition for farmers?
Okay, all good questions. So first of all, where's sustainability? Frankly, I mean, it depends a little bit on the circles you move in. I mean, if you sort of look at the UN and some of the development world, there's still, that word is still used, you know, quite a bit for good reason. Personally, I'm always trying to get people to understand that when we're talking about regenerative, we're talking about working with living systems. And living systems have a very particular function which other systems don't, is that they have the capacity to regenerate. So when we are talking about a food system or managing a system on the landscape, for it to be sustainable, it must be managed in a way that is regenerative, which leads me into explaining exactly what it, so I haven't really kind of defined or explained what I mean by regenerative agriculture, and maybe some people don't really have a firm grasp on it, which would be not unsurprising. I mean, to be honest, I know people who are involved in doing it who struggle to explain clearly what's exactly going on. The simplest way, I think, to explain it is that what we're talking about is we're talking about systems, both in the design and management of landscape, that instead of relying upon, say, fossil fuel inputs, in the form of machinery and chemicals to drive productivity, we're talking about using natural regeneration, which is to say the feature that plants and animals, but in this case particularly plants have, that when you disturb them or cut them, eat them, graze them, prune them, they will regrow. That is the engine upon which natural systems are propelled, right? That is the life force. That is what we're using to drive productivity in the system. And so all of our decision making and our management is effectively geared around that. So when we're talking about sustainability, when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, we are effectively talking about that. A lot of the, I suppose, detailed discussions about the how and the when and the why and the what, it gets bogged down in the detail, but fundamentally that's what we're doing. We're talking about trying to build a system that requires little to no external input, no fossil fuels, that is building health and fertility in the landscape through our production of food, fibre and fuel, because that is how we do it forever. And in the very short term, sort of immediate sense, the people, particularly in Aotearoa, New Zealand, who are increasingly embracing regenerative agriculture, they're on a pathway of, they're doing it because they can reduce costs, they can reduce the impact on the environment, they can see the benefit to, if they're managing animals, they can see the health benefits from that. They can, it's tangible benefits that can start year one. So to answer your third part of your question, so in terms of how do we get cut through, how do we get change? Well, I mean, this is a question of, how does politics work? To be honest, the most powerful thing, I think, where it starts, and excuse my language, but people just need to give a shit where their food comes from. If people do that, that's actually a very powerful thing. Reclaiming your engagement with your food, your connection, because effectively the health of the system where your food comes from is directly connected to the health of your own physical system. I'm using Western scientific language, but I know that Māori and other people have other ways of expressing exactly the same idea. This is not a new idea. We've always kind of known it, but for some reason in the last couple of generations, we've forgotten about that. And now the average, and even I hate using this word consumer, but the average consumer of food is expected to just go to a supermarket and trust whatever the pretty picture on the label is. Don't look at the fine print, just take their word for it and just consume, just buy stuff, right? And there's meant to be this huge distance between how it's actually made and the conditions of in which it was made and produced, and to not worry about all that stuff. And I think that is the kind of the shield, the mask, the shroud that stops us from really understanding, and also allows them, it gives them the license effectively to operate and do whatever the heck they want, up to and sometimes just over the legal limit of things, And so by genuinely caring about where your food comes from, that's a very powerful act. Because then we can start to support people who are doing the right thing. We can start to take more ownership. We can have more food sovereignty. We can start to have community. We can support veg box schemes. We can start to, take some of that back.
Interesting. Thank you, Shane. That's really thoughtful. Is there, do either of the two of you other panelists want to respond to that before I move you along? No? Okay, well, I think the terms and all of us using similar language to understand what the hell we're talking about in this big issue seems really important. And I think that was really great to have you, Shane, clearing up, like, what do you mean when you talk about regenerative agriculture? Because I think the confusion in this issue is part of what makes it hard for people to digest. And in that vein, we've got a couple of questions around, Catherine's got a really great comment in the chat there that you can have a read of. And there's a couple of questions for Pere around exactly how do you see us decoupling colonization and land use? Are there kind of practical steps you see there? And there's also a comment around needing to concentrate on climate and maybe not showing the same understanding of those links between issues. And so I'm not going to answer the question that Helen's got in the chat from a Greenpeace perspective, but just maybe, Pere, we'll hand to you first to talk about how you see that a little bit more, because maybe it's an area where we're not coming from the same common understanding.
Oh, how do we decouple, or how do we add some context and give some helpful detail? There are historical issues that are not being addressed. In terms of honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi, you know, there are gaps here that we're leaving out, and it creates chasms that confuse people, and then people will seek to perpetuate that confusion, so it perpetuates the status quo. And so, you know, we really need constitutional transformation to properly honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi and have fill in some of these holes. You know, we're a tax haven here in Aotearoa. We don't have a capital gains tax. We're not taxing, you know, wealth as we should. There are land taxes that we could be implementing. There are frameworks to recognize, you know, like te mana o te wai. There are frameworks that put the health of the environment first. And so these frameworks, we need to be embedding them with legislation and with constitutional reform to stop enabling farmers and local councillors from manipulating this system. When we have Māori sovereignty recognised, when we have Te Tiriti o Waitangi and honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi embedded in constitution, that's when we're going to see proper environmental protection here in Aotearoa. And if we continue to ignore that one and kick that one down the road, we're going to keep seeing this problem popping up again and again. For me, the best way to protect our environment is to protect Indigenous rights, the rights of tangata whenua. Sorry, that kōrero gets me worked up. What was your second question?
I guess part of what the question here is like, how do you work on decolonization and unwinding, as it's written here? What do you feel is a solution to unwind this land occupation while maintaining equity with current productive occupiers?
Oh, wow. I mean, it's impossible, right? You know, we can't have both of those things. For me, we really need to humble ourselves. We need to give up on this idea of having at our fingertips any type of food that we want. I really tautoko what Shane was saying in terms of reconnecting ourselves with our kai. It is essential. You know, it's just classic capitalism of disconnecting the consumer from the producer, and now instead we've got a salesman as the middleman in there, you know. And so yeah, humbling ourselves, recognizing that we can't all, you know, be millionaires and have this huge expansive parcels of land to ourselves. You know, we need to get rid of this mindset around the individual and focus on the collective. And it's an incredibly hard thing to do. As I say, while everyone is struggling under an unfair tax system, we don't have enough of us collectively feeding into what could be a possible solution. So yeah, for me, it is around addressing historical issues, providing people with welfare and what they need today so that they can start contributing. And yeah, understanding that we're all at different, you know, parts of the journey, that we need to meet everybody where they are at. Yeah, it's not an easy one. But yeah, the conversation is, how do we continue our current economic growth and also have environmental sustainability? And maybe that's a question for Shane, but I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate we're throwing some huge questions at you with not a lot of time. So thank you, panelists, for having a crack at tackling these. It's great, and thank you. Keep the questions coming, people. There's a couple of questions around kind of strategy and like where organizations like Greenpeace should be chucking their energy. So Christine, I might kick to you to talk a little bit about, you know, like while we've got this fight happening on many fronts, as Pere was just describing, there also has to be quite a targeted push and campaign to be regulating the agriculture industry. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit maybe about that side of the strategy. It sounds like we've opened it up big. Do you want to bring it back in a little bit for us around like how do you see people being able to work on this issue, and what's the kind of strategy that you were working to on this?
Oh, thanks. As I mentioned in a response to a question that people might not have seen, because 95% of New Zealand's dairy products are exported, even if everybody in New Zealand went vegetarian or vegan above the 10% that are at the moment, and that is quite a significant increase on previous years, it still wouldn't tackle the systemic nature of the problem. And so we look at what are the skinniest points that underpin this system. And so that goes right back to inadequate regulation of the inputs that drive dairy intensity. And so that's synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, palm kernel expiller, irrigation, and we have some significant wins on that in previous years. And I would also add under-regulated animal welfare in that. So all of these things allow this industry to go ahead and without regulation also of the impact. So that's why we've got polluted drinking water, polluted rivers, and destruction of the climate commons. And so that's increasingly also why we are focusing on Fonterra as the villain. You know, some Fonterra, everybody knows Fonterra. It's an easy target, but they've been off the hook because they've got so much power in the government. And so our theory of change is about targeting the inputs, but you know, that's pretty hard to mobilise people on, but the impacts are very clear to be seen. So we want people to act motivated by the impacts while recognising its regulation of the inputs that needs to happen. You know, we're all caught up in the system as consumers and as citizens, and so we have to use that power as activists that overarches all of the other selves that we are, to put pressure on the government because they've got the power to change this.
Thank you, Christine. Would either of the other panelists like to respond to that? I'm just going to make a plug that I can take one more question. So just a 30-second answer while people chuck their last minute questions in or upvote them.
Okay.
Go for it.
I've got something I'd like to say, just maybe spark a thought. So I think we need to sort of think about how we stop the bad and encourage the good. The situation on the ground is that for the large part, farmers, and I'm talking particularly about family farmers here, not corporate farmers, they're left to fend for themselves in a free market and juggle the roller coaster of that, be business people, while also trying to steward living systems on the land. And most of them, you know, doing this with no kind of training other than maybe what some of them have picked up at ag school or whatever, where they've been taught to treat it essentially as a mine and extract value. If we can change that, if we can give the best farmers a pathway out, a carrot, not just a stick, then I think that can really turn things around. We're starting to see some people doing it themselves anyway, but we could really accelerate that and have a really meaningful impact on the landscape at the same time. And then at the same time, while we're doing that, you know, for those of us that aren't necessarily engaged with farmers directly day to day or whatever, ask ourselves, well, what is the vision? What does the vision for our food system look like? You know, who's got that? Who's out there talking about what the vision should be? You know, who is it for? Who's the food system actually for? It's not for corporations. It's for you. It's for me. So what do we want? You know, what if we, I don't know, there's 100 ideas we could go into. It's a whole nother session. You know, what if we had farms that were removed from market forces that were just there for public good? I mean, there's all kinds of things we could do, but I'm just saying that, you know, it's a multifaceted problem. We can work together to help fix it, I think.
We haven't had a great influx of questions, so I'm gonna do two actually. And one I'm gonna ask because I would like to know the answer. Pere, can you tell us a little bit about your kind of greatest learnings from producing milk? We haven't really touched on that. And did you ever get a response from Fonterra? Can you tell us briefly about that project and how it went?
Sure. And I just wanted to go back to something that Christine said about how, you know, if everyone in Aotearoa reduced their dairy consumption, it wouldn't impact the global demand. I think it's a fair criticism, but I just like to play around with the thought in my head. Imagine if everyone in Aotearoa did boycott the dairy industry. It would send quite a formidable message, I think. And so I understand focusing on systems, but I just think even for myself, if all Māori, for example, if the indigenous population of Aotearoa were to boycott the dairy industry, and we get Kaitahu to diversify their dairy farms into something else, Shane can help them set that up. But if we had a boycott, and people understand boycotts, they can work. And so individual change, I don't want people to be discouraged in terms of individual change. And it's something that we encourage at the end of Milked, the film. In terms of my greatest learnings from Milked, to be honest, it was farmers are great people. And the systems that they are caught up in is not a fault of their own. We were welcomed into the houses of dairy farmers, and we sat at their dining tables, and we had kōrero with them about aspects of their industry that they didn't like. And that's a really, they put themselves in a vulnerable position to me. And if they know anything about me, they know that I'm an environmental and animal rights activist, and I'm trying to dismantle their industry essentially. And I know that a lot of those dairy farmers did know about me. And so for them to welcome me into their homes with the hospitality that they had, for me was just incredibly heartening. And it gave me a greater depth of understanding in terms of the struggles that farmers are faced with, that they're getting it from all sides. And for me, they're really missing strong, helpful leadership from their own industry. So what an incredibly confusing space it must be, especially for a farmer who is trying to farm in terms of an ecologically sound way. So that was the biggest takeaway for me from Milked, was that yes, we do need to be compassionate in our responses to farmers, but but absolutely things need to change. But they're human beings like all of us, and something has happened along the path in terms of our activism and our criticism of farmers, that there are these giant corporate farmers, and as Shane says, there are these family farmers, and they're just like us. They're just like us at the end of the day, and you shouldn't have to say that. You shouldn't have to say that. But the way that we've demonized a lot of farmers, it helps. It does no good. The greatest steps that I've seen in terms of people making progress is different communities, different farmers sitting down together and having conversations in terms of kind of what Shane is talking about. We need to re-envision, we need to reimagine what a farm is and what that looks like here in Aotearoa, and what the purpose of that farm is. These are big conversations that we do need to have. But yeah, in terms of my experience with Milked, it's that people are hungry for a solution. Everybody knows here in Aotearoa that the dairy industry is something that we got into, and it's at its limit. And however we get out, we're going to have to be creative, and we're going to have to come up with a solution together. But people know that we need to get out, and so that's been something that's been really positive for me. We're trying to come up with solutions and answers. We may not have it yet, but everyone is committed in that commitment that we do need to find something. That's where I'm at.
Beautiful answer. Thank you for that. That was great. I'm going to give Shane 1 minute to answer a question here about food security, and then I'm going to start to wrap us out. So Shane, would you like to answer the question around your views on the risk to food security from GE and pesticide use?
Yeah, I mean, again, not to sort of get too far off the topic of, that we're kind of mostly here for tonight, but I mean, the root causes for the degradation of our landscapes and the risk to our food security are the same. I mean, it is this industrial monoculture extractive approach to the way that we use land that is driving the worst things that we're seeing in the dairy industry, and also the worst things that we're seeing in horticulture and plant-based agriculture. I mean, we're losing something like, I think it was 50 football fields a minute. Yeah, 50 football fields a minute of soil around the world. And that is bad in Aotearoa as well. I can't remember the exact numbers here. It's huge. This is from, massive amounts of cultivation, from bare soil. the use of pesticides. I mean, that is one of the massive things driving biodiversity loss across the world. I mean, all of our agriculture, it's not just animal agriculture. I mean, animal agriculture, obviously, as we know, has huge impacts. But when you actually look at agriculture more broadly, you see that, you know, particularly when you're looking at biodiversity loss, soil loss, you know, plant-based agriculture, we're not doing that well either. I mean, that is an absolute disaster. And so, you know, when I'm talking about trying to find better ways, you know, it isn't about going back. It isn't replacing one industrial system with another. You know, trying to replace one industrial system on the land with another one in a lab or a factory that's powered by fossil fuels or anything else, trying to replace it with, you know, something out of a test tube. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's just more, you know, ecologically illiterate mumbo jumbo to try and disguise the fact that we don't know how natural things work, and it separates us even more from the natural systems that we've been destroying. So it's not an answer, and I feel like, you know, that's a whole other topic we can get into. But I think that you know, when we start trying to create Franken plants and all that kind of stuff, which is, you know, to not deal with the way that we're using our land and to sort of get ourselves off the hook from good land use, and that's not an answer to anything. It's just more problems.
Thank you. You've had some clangers for me. It was really nice to hear. Ecologically illiterate. I'll use that one in the future. It's a good way of thinking about the way we treat the world to have basic human functioning, such as food production. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap us up. I think it's been a hugely rich conversation, and the obvious takeaway is that there are a lot more conversations to have, and we can go into all of this in a lot more depth. So keep your eyes peeled for more of that. For me, it's really heartening that we have this kind of burgeoning field of experts in kind of change making on this subject. And I think you can kind of hear that in the expertise we have in the room, not just from the panelists, but in the chat as well, and that we have had kind of between 70 and 100 people throughout this call joining to talk about this on a Tuesday night. So I think we're in an election year. We're facing one of the biggest challenges humanity has ever faced, and the way we produce food is massively contributing to the climate change and ecological crises that are so inextricably linked. But we're on it, and we're all, it sounds like, keen to work together to figure out how to solve it. So for me, that's hugely heartening, and I thank you all so much for coming out to have this conversation tonight. So I'm going to hand over to Pere to close us out with karakia. Thank you so much, panelists.
Tēnā anō tātou, me mihi atu au ki ngā kaiwhakahaere anō, Neve, Christine, Elliot, Greenpeace. Thank you all for putting on the hui tonight. Kia pai te pō, e hoa ma, he karakia whakamutunga. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia i te urutapu nui kia wātia kia māmate ngā kau te tinana te wairua i te ara takatū. Ko ia rā e rongo, o ka iri ake ki runga kia wātia, ai rā kua wātia. Hau, pai marire. Pō marire, tātou, kia pai te pō.
Pō marire.
Kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora, thank you.
Okay.